right? Thanking and praising God once again, just flat out for the Sermon on the Mount. Let's call the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount Matthew. That's the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7. Let's call it Deeds. Understanding the progression that I see is, as we saw back in chapter 5, an extended discussion of healthy attitudes, leading to in chapter 6. An extended discussion of healthy motives, now leading to a discussion of healthy deeds, starting out in the first 6 verses with what I consider to be an interesting contrast. 2 famous illustrations: judge not. Even if you don't know much about the Bible, you know judge not so that you will not be judged. That's this chapter, starting in verse 1. And in contrast to that, he's going to talk about in verse 6, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs. Another relatively famous, even if it's less famous, another famous illustration. The contrast that I think I see there is basically, don't be so condescending in judgment that you end up condemning yourself in the condemnation or judgment that we render against others. Thus, the further illustration that he gives of with the measure we use, it will be measured back to us. The famous passage I've been quoting throughout most of the Old Testament. This is it. And beyond that, log splinter. Do not be so blinded by the log in your eye, a different version of the problem you see in others, that you are not able to accurately correct a smaller issue that actually exists in them. And so beyond not being so condescending that I'm actually condemning myself, I need to also be careful that I'm not so gullible or needy that I'm trying to focus or force healthy things on folks who are just interested in something else. Understanding that the illustration he gives using dogs and pigs draws on 2 animals that are notoriously driven by their appetites, among their other more favorable characteristics. Understanding that by the time we get to Philippians, as I mentioned from time to time, Paul, roughly around chapter 3, is going to talk about the danger of even believers being too driven by their appetites, and that being a pitfall that can basically derail an otherwise healthy path. Also in that same chapter, I think, using the metaphor of dogs. And so here, when Christ is talking about not giving our pearls to, what's holy to dogs and our pearls to pigs, he may be talking about the recurring theme throughout the Bible, a God who is motivated by the collective best interest of everyone, warning us not to waste our energy on trying to push those motives on people who are honestly just driven by their own ambitions and appetites. Going on, though, he is going to say in verse 7, using another famous illustration, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, and knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. That makes it seem like it's a blank check. Who cares about dogs and pigs? Everybody gets what they want. And not so much, because there is going to be a way to go about life that actually gets the good gifts that God is talking about in verse 11. Not saying that he is writing a blank check for everybody who simply asks him for stuff. Lo and behold, the rest of the chapter talks about there being a right way and a wrong way to go about doing stuff. Verse 12 saying, okay, if God is willing to give us good gifts, how should we treat others? And that's where we have the golden rule. If God is effectively answering your prayers, treat other people the way you want to be treated. Show kindness to them as well in return for the kindness he shows. Understanding that we can't really pay God back, but we can, as the term used to say, pay it forward. That may be why the golden rule is next. As he is then going to go on to that whole concept of the way in the famous passage in verse 13 that says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. Seeming to set off a string of about 4 illustrations that seem to set forth the distinction between what we might call healthy and, in our common language today, toxic ways. The healthy ways producing prolonged success, the toxic ways, not so much. Doesn't mean that they fail immediately, but eventually they are ways that are destined to fail, as he will go on to talk about the evidence of healthy ways in verses 15 through 19 in the famous passage, talking about beware of false prophets, people offering counsel that leads to not so much prolonged success, talking about the way in which you will know them by their fruits. Every healthy tree in verse 17 bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. And so one of the ways you might understand which way a person is headed may be seen in not only the way in terms of the path on which they have headed, but the way they go about doing things. Going back to that whole concept we talked about before, going back to David, a man of integrity, literally described as a man after God's own heart, reminding me of an illustration I use from time to time from Joe Frazier, ex-fighter who actually beat Muhammad Ali once. And I think he said that his father taught him that there is no right way to do the wrong thing and no wrong way to do the right thing. It might take a while to process that. Every now and again, even me just saying it now, I have to process it. But the bottom line is the ends do not justify the means. Meaning, just because you have a healthy goal set in mind does not license you to go about achieving that goal in any way you so choose. Joe Frazier understood it, and it seems that that is exactly what Jesus is teaching here, as he will go on in verses 21 through 23 to say that not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father. Understand that everybody's working in this passage. He's going to say in verse 22, on that day, many will say to me, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? They are industrious, but as Joe Frazier said it, they might have been trying to do the right thing the wrong way. Understanding the conclusion that God reaches in verse 23, then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Understanding that the path is not just the issue, it's the way that we go about, once again, trying to accomplish God's goals. Reminding me of David, understanding that he could have rejected his way as a shepherd boy, understanding that was not the most honorable job in the house. He could have been like, Dad, I got king skills. I don't want to be a shepherd. That is rejecting the path that eventually led him to the kingdom, or being king over Israel. Understanding that, accepting the way that led to the throne of Israel, but taking on shady ways only got him evicted off of his own throne after he slept with Bathsheba and had her husband Uriah killed. An illustration we have used before, a famous illustration that seems to once again underscore what God is saying here, or Jesus is saying here, about final judgment before God. There is both a way, a path that God has for us to walk, and there are ways in which he expects us to walk it that have everything to do with whether or not we get to where we're going and whether or not we get to stay. As the chapter will close out, we'll say it's beginning its descent in verses 24 through 27 with the famous illustration of the wise man who built his house upon the rock as opposed to the foolish man who built his house upon the sand. God bringing them both through situations that would eventually expose whether or not they had built the right way. Jesus seeming to remind us in chapter 5 that our attitudes towards the standards that God has set for us, those attitudes matter. Likewise, in chapter 6, our motives in life, they matter. And finally, here in chapter 7, the way we go about doing things matters. If we are going to find the kind of success that God is willing to ensure, even beyond our time and our struggles here.